time travel. Am I right? Ha! We really want to focus on the time travel of this film. Bruce Banner explains that Back to the Future is a bunch of bullshit. And you can't go to the past and just change the future because it's not in flux like that. Because as soon as you leave the present and enter the past, the present has become your past, and the past is now your new future, right? So it's a very like subjective point of view is like what he's saying. I guess kind of it's both, right? It's the fact that time is both objective and subjective, right? Like for yourself, but also you cannot like change the timeline that has already occurred, right? That's what his whole argument is.
His exact line is, if you travel to the past, that past becomes your future, and your former present becomes your past.
Right.
Which so can't now be changed by your new future.
Right.
Which
is a hilariously simple yet complicated way of explaining that.
Right.
So I actually love this, right? Because like automatically we're establishing ground rules of, you know, why they can't just go into the past and just kill Thanos, right? Which is, you know, Rhodey's joke.
Right. Can't we just, you know...
First of all,
that's horrible.
That's horrible.
Time travel comedy film. Book
it's Thanos.
I'm so right. It's insane.
It's Thanos. Right, but he explains why they can't do that. Right. But the loophole of that is there's nothing that says that they can't grab an object out of the past, bring it to the future, and not have that object actually work, right? And they test that out, of course, with the baseball mitt from Clint's home. I don't think they establish exactly how long ago that was, but I guess longer than 5 years.
Matter. Right.
Yeah, it doesn't. You're right. He grabbed something from the past, brought it, proved it works, right? So the plan is, as you had mentioned, they're going to go into the past. They're going to do a time heist, and they're going to grab the Infinity Stones, and they're going to bring them back into the current or the present timeline, the Endgame timeline, right? So one of the hard rules, and this is important, and this is something I really didn't, I don't know if I didn't remember this or if I didn't understand this the first time. And I'm really glad that we rewatched this film, because before this movie, Nick, I thought that this was a film that established its own rules for time travel and then largely ignored its own rules. And honestly, going back into it, I was like, actually, like, it pretty much, there's only one thing I can really think of that is kind of a plot hole in the rules that it establishes. Everything else is actually way more solid than I remembered. And it all comes down to the one big rule that the Ancient One establishes, right?
So glad you're bringing this up.
Yep. And this is what I totally ignored.
This is huge. Yeah.
Because people point out that there's a lot of things about the time travel that doesn't make sense. No, they actually specifically say that it's the Infinity Stones. If you don't return the Infinity Stones, that's what creates the branch timelines that eventually get annihilated and are destroyed, right? But as long as those Infinity Stones are brought back to exactly when they were taken, then the proper flow of time will keep going, right? So largely, and except for the one thing, we'll get to that, and it's maybe a problem, maybe it's not. Largely, the film respects this rule. So like any kind of like inaccuracies or anything that doesn't feel like this follows the rules, like Thanos' army not returning to the past or Gamora not returning to the past, it doesn't need to, right? Because of the rules it established about these Infinity Stones, right? Like technically they're not from the main timeline anymore. They're from some other, I guess, branched alternate timeline, and like this has become their new timeline, right? It's a weird loophole.
Yeah, we're gonna spend some time here because there's also something to be said about the fact when Banner's talking to the Sorcerer Supreme and she's explaining what happens if you remove the Time Stone, right? If you remove the Time Stone or any stone, another timeline branches off and it creates a new timeline, right? Of course, if you bring it back to the moment that you took it, everything works according to plan, right? As you're saying. The big question that came to my head was, so wait, at the Thanos actually destroying all of the stones at the end of Infinity War, is that really what causes this multiversal war that was the next phase of Marvel, which is where we are right now? Because that never got undone, right? They just pulled Infinity Stones from the past and then brought everybody back who died, but they didn't undo anything else that happened in the 5 years. They just brought everybody back, and then they put the stones back. So the only thing that really changed was everyone who was wiped out got brought back. But everything else stayed in motion, and the Infinity Stones not being a part of the main timeline is one of those things. Right? So that means that the stones were still destroyed in some timeline, potentially the current one. And if the time, and based on what the Sorcerer Supreme was saying, if you remove the Infinity Stones or the Time Stone, all hell breaks loose. And what do we have in the MCU right now is all hell breaking loose with this multiversal war that we're currently like in the midst of. So like when that part happened in Endgame, I was like, wait a minute. This is technically, is this the reason for everything else that's been happening? It's like very interesting.
that is a really good theory, actually. I really like that theory, because like the way she explains it sounds like, because like they are the foundation of like the universe, right? Without the stones, the universe like can't sustain itself, right? That's basically what she's saying. Like it'll fall to darkness, which like felt like a very vague reference to Dormammu specifically. But you know, take that as metaphorical or literal, right? No matter what, universe is fucked. And yeah, I really like that idea. Now, whether or not it's accurate, I mean, we'll find out, right? It's certainly something that they can play with,
right?
And maybe you are right. I think the way I would have interpreted it though is, so Thanos like destroys the stones, right? But they're not gone, if that makes sense. Because like, all right, so to borrow like an example that like Rocket uses, right? When he's doing a pep talk with Thor. When they're in Thor Dark World, right? And Thor's having a panic attack. And Rocket says, look, man, like everyone's lost people. Like, what do you think we're doing here? You know, there are people that are dead. And then there are people who are only, or he says there are people who are gone. And then there are people who are only kind of gone.
Dead,
and like, we can save those people, right? So like, I feel like that's the same thing with the stones in this case. Like the stones like are gone, but not really. Like the things that make the stones, like the things that make the stones are still there. I feel like they just can't be accessed by like sentient life at this point. Maybe that's me way stretching, but that's my interpretation of it.
Yeah, that feels like a little bit of a stretch about them being able to be
Recreated, if you will, with the resources that are left or available on the planet or in the world. I think that using your thoughts would make more sense if you were referencing the fact that because time travel has now been invented in the universe, technically they aren't totally gone because time travel has been established. So you could technically go back through time and do it again and grab the stones again and bring them to your present and then put them back. So I think I like
point,
that theory better.
Yeah.
Right? Like they're not. It's the same concept. It's more about the fact that time travel has been established now, so you can just go back and get them if you really need to or want to. Instead.
Okay, I actually just thought of. I just thought of perhaps a dumb argument against the ancient one. So her whole argument is, you know, if you remove the stones from the timeline, then that would doom the universe. But that suggests that time is linear. And that the stones would never have existed if you took them out. But they did, right? And we all know that time is a flat circle, so the stones always exist in the past, so there's no reason for the universe to not exist because the stones still exist, even if you remove them from the timeline and put them in the future. They're still there.
Well, it's the universe
they always happened.
It's, well, because what we know now of he who remains creating them to make them happen.
Wait, creating. Oh, I'm confused. He who remains creating the stones?
Not creating the stones, but creating the timeline, and then. right? Because my theory here is that there's one timeline currently in this Endgame MCU, right? And if you take one of the stones out, you start creating a branch timeline,
Right.
Which is what He Who Remains is trying to avoid, which we find out later.
Right.
So, with that in mind, he's using the stones as a way to keep order and keep one timeline in rotation. At least one of the ways he's doing it, right? Another way he's doing it is with the TVA and all these other things, right? But at least that conversation with the Sorcerer Supreme kind of implies that it's one of the ways that he's keeping the singular timeline intact with the Infinity Stones. So, and again, when Thanos destroys them, uses the stones to destroy the stones, he essentially creates this ripple effect, which is what we're currently still dealing with.
Right.
Potentially. I don't know.
I actually really love your theory on why the multiverse exists.
Yeah.
Right? Because, like, I mean, their idea of time travel is like a multiverse time travel idea, right? It's very Dragon Ball Z. See, I didn't reference Lost. How about that? It's very Dragon Ball Z.
By saying you didn't reference Lost, you inadvertently referenced Lost, and here
I referenced
It's a
previous
circle.
episodes of May the Review Be With You, not Lost. Okay. Maybe you should listen to it sometime. But anyway, yeah, it's if you're familiar, I know you are, but if anyone listening is familiar with like the Android saga, Trunks goes back in time to warn our heroes of androids that are coming from the future. Very Terminator-esque.
Yeah.
And by him talking to the past and warning the past, he inadvertently creates another timeline, right? Multiverse, baby. And that's basically what the Ancient One is implying here, right? It's by doing this, you create the multiverse, and that's what you're suggesting, which I wonder, to really get expansive on this, in Loki, there's a line that Renslayer says that I've been so curious about for a long time now, and it's when Loki argues to Renslayer when he's on trial about his crimes, right, of becoming a variant. And he says, well, what about the Avengers, right? Like, they did their whole time heist thing. Like, why aren't they here? And she specifically says what they did was supposed to happen.
Yep.
Supposed to happen. And we still haven't gotten an explanation quite yet as to what that means. But
well, oh my God. Oh, this is so great. I'm so glad you just said that. That was supposed to happen. Because without that happening, Loki doesn't end up in the TVA. And Loki needed to be in the TVA because He Who Remains was trying to look for somebody else to take over.
because he wrote it that way.
That's why.
See that? All right. You want to get really crazy here? Okay. So, all right.
But it's yeah. You go ahead.
Okay.
My
So
head hurts.
time is a flat circle, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. Avengers, what they did, the time heist, it's supposed to happen. Like what you said, he wrote it that way because Loki is supposed to eventually be the Loki variant that succeeds him, right? But you could also take this into meaning that it's supposed to happen because Tony Stark needs to invent time travel, right? So that eventually a Kang, not necessarily the Kang that we saw are the Victor Timely of the past, but a Kang of the future eventually is able to build on the foundation of that and begin, the multiverse crossover, right? In which like they all start meeting each other, and then eventually the multiverse war happens, and then everything explodes, and then the sacred timeline is created, and then the He Who Remains writes it out like, okay, that still has to happen, but I'm going to make sure that like the Loki like comes to like supersede me, right? You see what I'm talking about, right? It's
what happened first, the multiverse of war or Tony Stark inventing time travel?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. Oh my goodness.
Bananas.
Okay. This is fascinating. It's going to be really cool to see what other people think about this.